Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Vi from the TV show Arcane. Before we get too far into this, some real quick disclaimers. I can't technically diagnose fictional characters, but we can talk about general mental health concepts or overall themes for how mental health shows up for this character in this TV show. And I say TV show because I have never played League of Legends. I've just never done it. So if there are different ways that Vi shows up in the game versus the show, I will have no idea. I can only talk about Vi, Violet, if you will, in the TV show of Arcane. I also want to put out there that just because I am talking about mental health in a specific way or things that I've noticed as far as mental health doesn't mean that if other mental health professionals talk about mental health in a different way or other people in general, it doesn't mean that that's wrong. It just means that we can have more dialogue about this stuff, which is always a great thing to talk about mental health. I also want to put out there that I'm going to be talking about the entire show of Arcane, so there's going to be spoilers for that. I'm not going to be talking about like these chunks of episodes. No. Entire show. I don't want to be the bringer of spoilers, so take all of this as you will. When it comes to this character, I feel as though one of the biggest themes, one of the biggest things that I notice is this idea of trauma. Just because Vi shows or processes through her trauma differently than her sister does not mean that she doesn't experience as much trauma or traumatic events. I think that's an important thing to put out there. I also want to take a second and talk about like what trauma is, just so we're all on the same page. So when we talk about trauma, like in society, we often talk about trauma as though it is an event, like a big scary event that happens to us. And that's not actually what trauma is. Trauma is our reaction to a big or scary event that happens to us. It's more about how our brain processes these events that happen to us, which also makes it subjective. So we can have two people who experience the same event and one can process it as trauma and the other could not. And that's okay. But because trauma is subjective in that way, because trauma is more about how an individual processes trauma, I want to add that when I'm saying these events could be traumatic for this character, I'm technically kind of guessing and I'm making assumptions here. And I feel like saying that because if it feels to me like if I'm saying this is definitely trauma, it feels like saying like this is for sure how you feel. It like that has the same energy. That has the same mood. I don't like that. I do feel like I'm making assumptions here about these things could have been traumatic for Vi just because trauma is so subjective in that way. One of the first things that we see kind of sets the scene, sets the mood for these characters and the show. And we are introduced to Vi and Powder, and we're kind of told that their parents are gone. Like gone. We also have this assumption, or I had this assumption, that Vi witnessed her parents' death in a violent way. This was a battle, if you will, on this bridge for people from the Undercity to try to get to something about the top side. Anyways, when we lose our parents, that by itself can be traumatic. Like parents are really supposed to teach us things about the world and provide this safe, loving environment for us and basically teach us things to help us be happy, healthy individuals. But there's a huge safety element, ideally, that comes with parents. And to lose our parents in such a violent way and to especially see that happen in front of us, I feel like that really teaches us, well, shit, the world's not safe. That safety can be taken from us suddenly, or people that we care about can be taken from us so suddenly. There are a lot of lessons, I guess, that we can take from that. When I say lessons, just because we learn these lessons does not make them logical or helpful.
Can you just send in whoever's gonna kick the shit out of me so I can get on with my night?
You want us to have a chat with her?
No.
These types of lessons are often the kinds of things that we learn with trauma. Just because we learn something doesn't make it helpful. This also caused a shift in the family dynamics. So in an ideal family, with an ideal family dynamics, we have parents, right? And I put them up top because ideally parents have the power and the control in the family. And then kids underneath them. Vi and Powder lost their parents, but Vi was the older sibling. So the shift in power dynamics was that suddenly Vi felt like she had to fill her parents' role. She had to fill her parents' job and be responsible for her sister and take care of her much like a parent. So losing her parents at such a young age caused Vi to feel suddenly more responsible for her sister than she really should have been. So that's a very like pivotal, important moment in like Vi's development as she's growing older, but also just in general. There's also this idea that we kind of see later on where, because Vi knows that like her parents' death was caused by like Topsiders, Enforcers, that kind of stuff, she carries a lot of bitterness for Topsiders and Enforcers. And when we experience trauma from a young age, kids have a hard time understanding the gray area or like the vagueness that can come with the world. Kids often see the world very concrete, very black and white, as in like it's either good or it's bad. But when we experience trauma as a kid, again, we fit it into a kid's worldview, which is in very good, very bad. And so I can see something like this being something where Vi then classified things as, well, if you're from the Undercity, you're good. Or if you're from Topside, you're bad. Or if you're Enforcer, you're bad. And we see this later on because she has a really hard time seeing the fact that like maybe Caitlyn isn't bad, even though she's an Enforcer. We have a hard time she has a hard time figuring out that gray area. I think that has a connection to what happened to her parents and with how young she was. Because even though she was older than her sister, she was still young. After the death of her parents, Vi then became adopted by Vander and like she kind of became part of this group of married men. She was still closer to Powder than the rest of them, but she had this group of adopted siblings. And Vi, she really took on the role of a leader, of like the hero of the family, if you will. She was the one who led them into things. We see this where she led them into the heist and things like that. But then if something went wrong, so when the heist went wrong, I feel like that was also something that could have been traumatic for her, because when something went wrong, but she saw herself as the leader, she blamed herself. When we talk about trauma, we often develop these beliefs. It's often about ourselves because of this trauma. And I feel like when she saw herself as the leader, plus something went wrong, or people that she cared about could have been hurt or were being harassed by the Enforcers, who were, again, like the bad people, I think that Vi saw it as like, I messed up. I did this. I caused terrible things to happen to people that I care about. And so much so that she was willing to turn herself into the Enforcers to save the people that she cared about. I feel like there's also trauma that relates to feeling helpless and like she can't control anything. Because when we see Vi being locked in the basement and Vander is being taken by Silco, Vi seems like she's feeling so helpless. Again, trauma isn't about the event itself. It's not that blood was spilled on the windows. Like, yes, that is scary and that is terrible. But I don't think that is what would actually make that event traumatic for Vi. I think it's more about the fact that she couldn't control it. And it's more about the fact that she couldn't do anything about it. I think those concepts would have been why that event, when she's in the basement, would have been traumatic for Vi. Especially when you add in this element of the fact that she was used to being able to do something because she was the older sibling, because she, was this brawler and like got this high score on things as far as like, punching or whatever. They showed her as though she was able to do stuff, but then she couldn't. And it impacted people that she cared about. It's our perception of these traumatic events that really makes it traumatic. I think that's why that moment when she's in the basement could be a traumatic event for Vi. And again, trauma is something too where it adds up over time, becomes this big lovely trauma sandwich. We have these layers where Vi ends up becoming this protective figure. That's how she sees herself. And then starts maybe telling herself that she's failed if she hasn't done that, and blames herself if she hasn't done that, feels responsible if she hasn't done that. And all of that, these layers add up. And we see it add up when she tells Powder, like, stay home, and they're going to try to save Vander, right? Because if she's the protective one, if she's responsible, her version of safety in that moment is telling Powder to stay home. Of course, Powder disagrees with her, but that's a different conversation. But then seeing that Powder didn't stay home, I really wonder if that was traumatic for Vi too, because she's trying to get control back by getting Vander back. She's trying to do something about this, especially because her role is the protector. Her role is the leader. Her role is the hero. And I say hero as in like that's who she plays in this family, not literally the story of Arcane. And yet she couldn't stop Powder from being put in a situation that impacted her. And I think that becomes especially hard later on when she couldn't stop Powder from being put in a position where she went to Silco. And all of these things are layers. They're all different layers. And these layers really start adding up when Vi witnesses the death of her siblings and Vander, right? Like, this is her adoptive family. And she couldn't stop it. It kind of breaks her view of being the one who can do something about it, being the one who can stop terrible things from happening to her family. In a lot of ways, too, she sees Vander's death before Vander died. Vander and Shimmer was not the same Vander that she knew. So we see Vi, whose entire worldview and perception of herself starts to break, which is traumatic. She just wants to help her family and protect them. You know, the show really emphasizes that with Powder. When Powder is screaming that she just wanted to help. She just wanted to help. Well, shit, so did Vi. Vi just wanted to fucking protect her family. And it can be so traumatic to see that being taken out from under her again and again and again with Milo and Clagger and Vander, like all of them just repeatedly in front of her. And Vander was taken from her emotionally and mentally before he was taken physically in a lot of ways, right? And even then, his last words to her was to be that protective role. And so it's basically like saying, hey, keep doing that thing that you're doing, right? But in her mind, it's like, fuck, I'm not doing that anymore. So that adds to the trauma. This idea of like, shit, well, this is the one thing I was supposed to do and I'm not doing it anymore. And Vi is still a child. She is still a child. She doesn't have as much ability to cope as an adult would. And all of these traumas happen in a very short amount of time. It's difficult for us if we have a great deal of trauma in general, yet alone like a very short amount of time. She didn't have time to process this or deal with it or anything like that. And so she lashes out at her sister, the only family that she has left, the only family that she would have left to protect. And so there's a lot of trauma around the idea of like how she lashes out at Powder. Because in general, yes, she lashed out. She even physically hit her. And she also said the one thing that she never said to her sister. Vi was one of the few family members who didn't, bully her, essentially, who didn't call her a Jinx, who really tried to support her sister. But because Vi didn't know how to cope with the fact of like losing everybody, but not only that, like she suddenly had the knowledge that Powder had something to do with that. And like Powder didn't know, right? Powder's also a child. So Powder was proud that she finally did something. She thought that she was helping. But in Vi's mind, it's like, you were part of causing the death of people that I loved. And I couldn't do anything about it. I imagine there's a certain element of it too where there's that control aspect where it's like, I couldn't stop you. I couldn't stop you from a choice that was impactful that we can't take back. And so there's all that stuff before it that caused it to be the situation where Vi lashed out. There's the lashing out itself. And then afterwards, Vi shames, blames, and guilts herself for the fact that she actually lashed out. I think there's a lot of this too where it's reconciling two ideas. So trying to sit with the fact that Powder is someone that I love, but she made a terrible choice. She did a terrible thing. How do I figure those two ideas out? But then there's also another idea where it's like Vi sees it as her job to protect her family, especially her sister. And she did a terrible thing to her. How do I reconcile those two things? And all of this is additional trauma. It's everything that led up to how Vi lashed out, the actual lashing out, right? Calling her Jinx, calling her this name that she never did, like leaving her in the street. And then how she sees it afterwards where it's like, I can see it where being something where Vi is like, I didn't protect my family before, and look what happened to them. Something terrible happened to them. And then I didn't protect Powder, and now something will happen to her, right? There's so much to the trauma that Vi experienced. And I think a lot of that trauma causes Vi to blame herself. There's a moment where Vi looks down at her hands, and I think what's happening there is she's seeing Vander's blood on her. And I think there's a moment where she sits there thinking to herself that she literally has Vander's blood on her hands, like emotionally, mentally. I guess it's not literally. Anyways, but it's this moment where she's like, I'm responsible. Like, I have his blood on my hands. I'm responsible because I didn't do enough. My job was to be the protector. I didn't do enough, therefore I'm responsible. Trauma makes it to where we see our part in whatever happened is bigger than it was. So we will tell ourselves things like, well, if only I'd done this, or if only I'd done that. And we place blame on ourselves for stuff that wasn't our part. And I feel like that's what's happening even in that moment. I feel like those are some of the biggest traumatic moments that the show really shows for Vi. There are other things later on, like seeing Powder with Silco. I think it could be easy to see Silco as like the enemy, right? Like he's the one who destroyed all of the rest of the family. All of them. And so it could be easy for Vi to see him as the enemy, the bad guy. And then to realize that her sister is with him, like willingly, and she's described as being like a daughter to him. I think that could be really hard because, again, it could be a reminder that to Vi, like, I didn't protect my sister enough. I didn't do my job. It could bring up all of those past traumatic memories and even re-traumatize us. But also this idea of, well, what about Vander and our siblings? Like, did they not exist? What was all of that for? I think that that could also be a part of that too. There's also a moment later in the show where Powder lashes out and attacks Vi and Caitlin on this bridge. And I believe that is the same bridge that their parents died on. And so to have everything come full circle, to have it be where they have worked so hard to really feel like they're reaching out to Powder, becoming sisters again, and then to have Powder instead take that like hand that has been put out to her in a form of friendship, in the form of family, and to instead attack her sister, I think that could also be traumatic too. And when we talk about all these traumatic things for Vi, I can't help but feel like guilt is such a huge part of this character and what we see with Vi as well. And to clarify, guilt is this real or perceived responsibility for an event or something that's happened. And it's very much connected to trauma because, again, trauma makes us feel as though our part in something was bigger than it actually was. So we blame ourselves for these traumatic, scary things that happened in the past, and we have a hard time seeing that these things were not our fault. So if someone were to say to us, oh, but like, that wasn't your fault, or how could you have known? We'll kind of yeah, but our way out of it. It's like, yeah, but here's what I should have known, or here's this other thing I should have known, or whatever. One of the biggest things that Vi seems to be guilty about is the huge sense of responsibility and feeling as though she has failed with being a parent or a hero or a leader for her siblings. And this isn't a role that she purposefully went out and got. She can go to the store and be like, hey, I want to be a parent. This is something that she just kind of fell into. It wasn't purposeful, but when her parents died, it seems like she saw it as her responsibility as the older sibling to be a parent for Powder, and I imagine that kind of like fell in with the other siblings that were adopted kind of around her little band of merry men, so to speak. I can imagine that being set in a little more too when someone that she admired, her adoptive father, Vander, would lecture her and point out like, hey, you're kind of the leader of these guys, make sure you're responsible, that kind of thing. And not only that, but Vander was also a leader in his own right. So if Vi looked up to Vander and saw him being a leader, it would be easy to try to emulate that, try to be like him. And when we are playing the hero in our family, that's the role that we see ourselves in our family. Again, this is not something that is done purposefully. We often look responsible. We look like we're the achiever. We're the one who gets A's and does well in school. But then behind the scenes, internally, we often feel guilt and shame. We often feel like we're not doing enough. And we see this with Vi. She blamed herself. She felt guilty for not doing enough to protect her family, even though she could not have known about the things that were going to happen or couldn't have done more. She was still a child for the vast majority of things that happened. But Vi doesn't see it that way. She also carries guilt for literally everyone in the Undercity. She has a conversation with Echo where she even says, if I could have been here, if I could have done more, as though her actions could have actually changed things or at least have helped people process things differently. And even Echo points out, like, that's not great. It's not a great thing to carry around with you or to like a perspective on life. But she takes on the responsibility of the world as though the world's happiness is on her shoulders. And then she feels guilty if the entire world isn't happy. Sometimes we also see her guilt come out as anger. This can be something that comes out with the enforcers, maybe a little bit at Caitlin or Vander. Anger is something that we sometimes talk about as a secondary emotion, as in there's often something underneath the anger that is causing the anger. Not to say that we can't actually just feel angry, but oftentimes there's something underneath the anger that can be hurt, embarrassment, trauma. A bunch of things can be underneath anger. In some of these cases with Vi, I think there's guilt underneath her anger. You know, when she is angry at the enforcers who come down to the Undercity, I wonder if there's guilt underneath that. Like, she's feeling guilty that the heist went the way it did, and she made the decision to go on the heist in the first place, so she's feeling that responsibility. I already talked before about the trauma that was involved with the situation with Powder, where Vi called Powder a Jinx. There's obviously a lot of trauma involved in that, but I think that all of that trauma means that Vi feels an incredible amount of guilt about it. I think that Vi looks at that as though I was supposed to protect my sister. It was Vander's last words to me. Plus, I've spent my entire life doing it. I should have done it more. And I think that she looks at that like, well, I didn't cope perfectly. I didn't handle the situation perfectly. I didn't do it the way that Vander would have wanted me to. Therefore, you know, like I'm a terrible person or I failed. I think that those negative thoughts would be very easy for Vi to have in that moment. I think that Vi would have a hard time seeing the fact that she was also a child. I think that Vi would have a hard time seeing the fact that the more traumatic experiences that we have, the harder it is to deal with them. Because these things that I'm saying in this moment are ways of giving yourself grace, are ways of giving yourself forgiveness, even pointing out, like, how can we cope perfectly? What would that even look like? I think that Vi would have a hard time seeing all of that. I think that Vi would be more likely to tell herself that it was her job to protect her sister and she shouldn't have done that. She should have done better. I think that those are the kinds of thoughts that Vi would probably be having about that situation because of the amount of guilt that she carries and all of those the way that guilt is kind of connected to trauma. Vi has a hard time giving herself grace and also feeling as though she has worth or that she's worthy of good things like help or change or relationships. And maybe that's why she really pushes away help from Caitlin. It's this idea of, I've done so many terrible things and people around me get hurt, that kind of idea, that I'm not worthy of this. And I've mentioned before this idea that Vi felt as though she was a parent or responsible for her sister. And I think the idea of parentification, which is a big word, I'm going to mess that up, is an important concept to talk about too with Vi. Parentification is this idea where in an ideal world, parents take care of kids, right? That's why when I keep gesturing about families, I'm like, parents are up here and kids are down here. So parentification is when the roles are reversed in some way. So that would be when kids take care of parents or when kids end up taking care of other family members. So in this case, that would be Vi taking care of her sister. And this doesn't have to be on purpose. Like the situation where Vi and Powder lost their parents, that obviously wasn't on purpose, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact. When we have parentification, it can be traumatic because the person who is being parentified, the person who's playing the role of the parent, that's an easier way to phrase it. Really, I should just say that instead. We don't have the chance to form secure attachments with the world around us. Like, we end up not having our own needs being met. We put our own needs to the side so that we can take care of whoever we're taking care of, a parent, another family member, that kind of thing. So in that way, that just the concept of parentification can be traumatic. It also means that we have a hard time often validating ourselves because we've spent so long putting our needs aside. Because with parentification, often once we start becoming the parent in our family, we often keep doing it. And this seems to be a huge thing with Vi. This is connected to the traumas. This is connected to the guilt because she ends up playing the role of a parent ever since her parents die. She continues to play the role of a parent even when she's adopted by Vander. And she looks for Powder, even as an adult, to continue to almost play the role of a parent. Even putting that aside a bit, she doesn't recognize her own struggles, potentially because she has spent her whole life putting her own needs aside, not validating her own needs, because that's just what she's used to. When she gets out of Stillwater, when she gets out of prison and we see all of that, she doesn't even recognize that she struggled, that was suffering, that by itself could be traumatic. She doesn't recognize that. She doesn't recognize the fact that she's been in prison for years, that she was beaten for years, that she was falsely imprisoned. She doesn't recognize any of that. That is never what she talks about. I mean, not really, right? Or if she does, it's with a bit of humor as a defense mechanism, right? She only focuses on how to get to Powder. That is her sole drive, really. It's as though if she gets to Powder, she can change the past, she can fix everything. and maybe not feel so guilty. Parentification also has a connection to imposter syndrome, because if we are the parent in whatever dynamic we're talking about, we have been sacrificing our own needs and not validating them, meaning we don't have a realistic sense of what our abilities are. So, because we've just never validated them. When Vi sees Vander standing in front of her, it doesn't seem like a hallucination because it's not like a persistent thing. It only happens once. It seems like the show's way of trying to show her that the image or the idea of Vander and like how he was a role model for her is still motivating. And when I think of that, I think of this idea that she didn't feel like she was motivating for herself. And we see that throughout the show. Vi does not do something for herself. Her motivations are Powder, and at that particular moment of the show, Vander. But Powder is like the prime motivator for Vi. She has a hard time recognizing her own strengths. Or if she does, it's only because it is a means to an end with Powder. That's not quite the same. I think Vander is also a huge part of what has probably impacted Vi. We see that they are, in a lot of ways, mirror images of themselves. You know, Vander seems to be a huge role model for Vi, you know, like early in her life, plus, you know, the, again, not a hallucination, the imaginary Vander, I don't know, pick your word with that. They are both boxers, brawlers. Vi is a leader who feels responsible for everyone, just like Vander was. You know, Vander kind of led the Undercity. How they show their emotions at times is also very similar. Vander talks about how he stormed that bridge where Vi's parents died because he wanted a better life. And Vi talks about how she wants a better life for Powder. We also see Vi encouraging her siblings, just like how Vander encouraged her. Even Silco called Vi like Vander's Vander's person. Can't think of that word. And this isn't necessarily something that I think is like a mental health thing, but more of, I guess, a plot point or a narrative thing. But the show talks about how Vander had like one regret, one thing he could not forgive himself for, his own trauma, if you will, where he attacked his brother, Silco. Not literal brothers, but, you know, figurative, is in the sense that we choose our family. And that was his one big regret. And that impacted how Vander saw himself and how Silco saw himself. Vi had something very similar. She lashed out at Powder, and that was the one thing that she could never forgive herself for. Vi feels like a mirror image of Vander in so many ways, despite the fact that Vander really tried to raise her to be different, even telling her to be kind to Powder. And it's one of those things where none of this is Vi's fault. Trauma is never your fault. There's actually so much mental health in Arcane that I had to work hard to condense the ideas into what you see today. But the show really talks about mental health in a way that felt realistic, but also in a way that felt understandable for so many of these characters, in a way that you can look at these characters and say, it's not your fault. This is trauma. This is so many other things. When I think about Vi, I think the biggest thing is that just because her trauma looks different from someone else's doesn't mean it's not valid, doesn't mean it's not real, doesn't mean she doesn't carry it around with her. We can look fine, but still carry shit around with us. But I would love to hear your thoughts on the video and even Arcane, and I will see you next time.